the outsider, the feudal world might have looked solid, with its castles standing tall, its lords swearing oaths, its kings crowned by bishops beneath vaulted cathedral ceilings. It gave the illusion of structure, of order. But beneath that surface, power in the Middle Ages was never secure. It pulsed like a wound that never healed, always vulnerable to the next shift in loyalty, the next famine, the next ambitious cousin with a private army and a grudge. Feudalism was built on land and loyalty, but both were deeply unstable. Land could be lost in war or stolen by a rival claim, and loyalty, that was never guaranteed. Oaths of fealty were sworn with one hand on the Bible and the other hand on the hilt of a sword. These were promises made to buy time, to secure alliances, to protect what was already under threat. When the balance shifted, so did the loyalty, and when it broke, rebellion followed. The truth was this: in a feudal society, everyone was afraid of the person above them, and everyone doubted the person below. Kings feared their barons. Barons feared their vassals. Even peasants who owned nothing could be dangerous when hungry or desperate enough. The entire structure stood only as long as fear outweighed anger. But when fear broke, when the king was seen as weak, or when famine turned loyalty into resentment, violence followed like winter after harvest. Rebellions came in waves, and they came from every direction. Some were led by nobles dissatisfied with royal interference, eager to protect their estates or expand them. Others came from within royal families, brothers, uncles, sons turning on the king himself, each claiming a more legitimate right to the throne. And then there were the peasant uprisings, rare but always explosive. Brutal in their suddenness, short-lived but terrifying in the message they sent, that even those at the bottom could shake the pyramid if they rose all at once. England alone saw countless rebellions throughout the Middle Ages. After William the Conqueror seized the throne in 1066, he spent years crushing uprisings from the very barons who had sworn loyalty to him. A century later, the civil war between King Stephen and Empress Matilda tore the country apart as nobles switched sides again and again, trading loyalty for land, betrayal for advantage. France was no different. The kings of the Capetian dynasty spent generations trying to bring rebellious dukes and counts under control. The dukes of Normandy, Brittany, and Aquitaine ruled like kings in all but name. At any given time, the French king controlled less than half of what was technically his kingdom. In the Holy Roman Empire, the problem was even worse. The emperor was elected by powerful princes who owed him nothing once he was crowned. Rebellions and local wars were not the exception, they were the rule. The emperor was king of kings, but a king with no leash to hold the wolves beneath him. And always, rebellion wasn't just about politics, it was personal. A disputed inheritance, a broken engagement, an insult delivered at the wrong banquet. These were not cold, calculated revolts. They were often eruptions of pride, vengeance, ambition, lit by years of quiet hatred. And when war broke out, the countryside paid the price. Armies moved through like locusts, stripping fields, burning homes, taking livestock. Villagers who had sworn loyalty to the wrong lord were punished without mercy. Loyalty became a death sentence. Neutrality was impossible. In this world, no oath could be trusted beyond the moment it was spoken. No alliance was safe. No crown was ever truly stable. Feudalism promised structure. But what it delivered was tension held under pressure, century after century. And sometimes all it took was a rumor, a whispered betrayal, a drought, a noble insult for that pressure to explode. In the Middle Ages, rebellion was not an accident. It was an outcome, inevitable, expected. The system was not designed to prevent it. It was designed to survive it, at least until it couldn't. Loyalty in the feudal world was not a virtue. It was a gamble. You swore an oath because you had to, because land depended on it, because your family's future hung on a sentence spoken in the hall of your lord or the chapel of your king. You placed your hand on a Bible or on the steel of your sword and promised fealty, not because you believed, but because you had no other choice. And yet, even when that oath was true, even when your loyalty ran deep, it could still destroy you. Because in a world where power constantly shifted, to stand beside the wrong man at the wrong moment was to forfeit everything. If your king went to war and won, you might be rewarded. But if he lost, if he was captured, exiled, or killed, then your name, your land, and your family would fall with him. You would be labeled a traitor to the new regime, and in the best-case scenario, you would be stripped of your lands. In the worst case, you would be hanged from your own castle wall. Imagine it. You kneel in a great hall, surrounded by nobles and torches. You speak your oath clearly, you mean it. You serve faithfully for years, fighting, taxing, bleeding for your liege, and then one day a different banner rises on the horizon. The king is dead or worse, deposed, and you have become a liability. There were countless such men in history, lords who stood by their king until the end and paid for it with their lives. In the War of the Roses, noble families backed House Lancaster or House York and watched their homes burned, their sons executed, their daughters married off like prizes to the victors. A generation of nobility was extinguished by choosing wrong, not by betrayal, by loyalty. In Scotland, during the Wars of Independence, entire clans were wiped out because they supported a king who fled or failed, castles razed. Names erased from records, children hidden or smuggled into other families to survive. Even the knights who followed William the Conqueror into England understood the risk. Had the invasion failed, they would not have returned home in shame. They would have been hunted down and executed as invaders. Their lands in Normandy would have been seized. Their loyalty would have meant nothing, only that they died for the wrong cause. And for those who betrayed their lords in the hopes of survival, the danger was just as great. If your rebellion failed, your execution would be public, prolonged, symbolic. You would not die as a traitor, you would die as a warning. There was no safety in loyalty, there was no safety in betrayal, only the moment, only the calculation. Do I kneel? Do I follow? Do I run? Feudal loyalty was not about trust, it was about timing. And the tragedy was this. Even the most loyal man, the one who never lied, never betrayed, never broke an oath, could still lose everything if the crown above him slipped. There is an image repeated throughout medieval chronicles. A nobleman hanging from the walls of his own fortress. The same fortress where, months before, he had welcomed his lord with a feast, raised his banner in the courtyard, sworn his loyalty before all. Now his body swings from a rope tied to a window he once looked out from his master. The message was clear. Loyalty is not enough, loyalty is not protection, loyalty is risk. And in the real-life Game of Thrones, no one, not even the most faithful, was ever truly safe. The feudal world was built on a simple idea. Land is power. Whoever owns land rules. Whoever works the land obeys. For centuries this idea held. Through war, famine, rebellion, and betrayal it endured. It bent, but it did not break. The king gave land to his lords. The lords gave land to their knights. The knights controlled the peasants. And the peasants in their millions tilled the soil that fed the entire system. But eventually something shifted. Not with the clash of swords, not with the fall of a castle, but quietly, gradually, like a tide. It began in the towns. While the lords waged wars and knights swore oaths, another kind of man was rising, the merchant. He didn't own land, he didn't command armies, but he had something new, something dangerous, money. In medieval Europe, especially from the 12th century onward, trade began to flourish. Markets grew in size and complexity. Roads reopened, rivers buzzed with ships. Towns that had once been little more than muddy intersections became centers of commerce. And inside those towns, people were doing something revolutionary. Making wealth without owning land. The merchant class did not fit into the feudal pyramid. They were not knights, they were not peasants, they were not vassals or lords, they were outsiders. And yet they were growing rich, sometimes richer than the very nobles who had ruled for generations. As trade increased, money began to replace loyalty. A king no longer needed to give land to raise an army. He could pay for one. A noble no longer needed to marry off a daughter to gain a fief. He could take a loan, hire a force, and seize it instead. A serf who escaped to a city could work, earn a wage, and in some places buy his freedom. There was even a saying, "Town air makes free." Suddenly the entire logic of feudalism was under pressure. Land was still valuable, but it was no longer the only currency of power. And then came the kings. For centuries, kings had been little more than first among equals. They ruled, but only with the support or permission of their great lords. But now, with money flowing into royal coffers from taxes, trade tariffs, and mining, monarchs began to centralize power. They built national bureaucracies. They created standing armies paid with coin, not oaths. They passed new laws, written laws that applied not just to nobles but to all. And slowly, brick by brick, they built something new. The modern state. The old feudal order began to rot from within. Lords who once ruled like kings in their own domains were now answerable to royal officials. Knights were no longer the elite warriors. Cannons and crossbows made castles vulnerable. Peasants, once bound to the land, fled to cities or took part in revolts fueled by rising expectations. Even the church, once the spiritual glue of the feudal world, faced challenges. The rise of universities, of literacy, of debate, all chipped away at its absolute authority. By the 15th century, in most of Europe, feudalism was no longer a system. It was a memory. Some of its terms survived: lord, vassal, manor, but their meaning had changed. What once was the game of kings and lords became the foundation of law, property, and modern class. The Game of Thrones had not ended. But its rules had changed, and those who still played by the old rules, those who still clung to oaths, land, and the sword, found themselves outmaneuvered by a different kind of power. the power of gold, of contracts, of ink. Feudalism did not fall in one great crash. It dissolved, not with a scream, but with a signature. Feudalism is over. The castles have crumbled. The knights have long since ridden into legend. The great oaths of loyalty that once echoed through stone halls are now footnotes in textbooks, and yet it never truly left us. We live in skyscrapers, not fortresses. We swipe cards instead of forging swords. But the logic that built the medieval world, power through hierarchy, loyalty for protection, fear wrapped in ritual, still lingers, woven deep into how our world is structured. We still speak their language. Not the exact words, but the ideas behind them. We talk of lords in business, of loyalty in politics, of kingdoms in corporate empires. We label people as elite, as underlings, as foot soldiers. Our systems reward those who climb, who swear allegiance to the powerful, who play the long game with quiet calculation. In many parts of the world, land is still power. The division between those who own and those who work remains sharp, and though no one stands on a castle wall anymore with a banner in the wind, we still fight for position, not always with steel, but with influence, with legacy, with law. The structure of feudalism, king, lord, vassal, peasant, has become a metaphor, but it is a metaphor we live in every company where orders flow downward and profits flow upward. In every institution where access is decided by rank, in every system where loyalty is rewarded until it is. Even our laws are shaped by what feudalism left behind. The idea that land is inherited, that property can be passed through blood, that authority is layered and conditional, all of that traces back to the rules written by men who lived in stone towers and believed the world should never change. But the world did change. It moved on from knights and manors. It chose trade over tribute, contracts over oaths, cities over fields. And yet the bones of that older world still lie beneath our feet. We build new systems on top of old assumptions. We innovate within invisible walls. The ghost of feudalism does not haunt us with armor or banners. It haunts us through the invisible weight of tradition, through the way we measure success, through the way we treat power as something vertical, inherited, and difficult to challenge. But here's the difference. In the Middle Ages, most people were born into their place and died there. Today, we tell ourselves we can move. We believe we can rise, and in many places we can, but the path is still narrow, the climb is still steep, and the rules are still written by those who stand above. So what do we do with this legacy? We remember it, not with nostalgia, not with romanticism, but with clarity. We remember that the systems we inherit are never neutral. They were built for someone's benefit, and they can be changed. Feudalism teaches us that power, once entrenched, defends itself. That loyalty, when weaponized, can silence dissent. That rebellion is not always chaos. Sometimes it is the beginning of justice. And it teaches us that even the most rigid systems eventually crack. Not because the people inside them become stronger, but because the ideas holding them up become weaker. The Game of Thrones may have ended, but the game of power never does. The board changes, the players rotate, the pieces evolve. But the question remains the same. Who holds the land, who gives the orders, and who dares to challenge the crown? Forget democracy, forget elections, forget your rights. In the Middle Ages, land owned you. It didn't matter who you were, a peasant in a field, a knight in shining armor, or even a king with a golden crown. Everything you had, everything you hoped to be, was tied to one thing: how many acres of soil you could control, and who you were willing to kneel to in order to keep it. Because in medieval Europe, land wasn't just property. It was the currency of power. It was your job, your home, your protection, your inheritance, your identity. And above all, it was the foundation of loyalty. This was a world without banks, without factories, without digital wealth. A world where every field meant food and every fortress meant control. If you owned land, people depended on you. If you didn't, you depended on someone who did. From the great kings of France and England, all the way down to a knight commanding a single manor, every person existed in a vast web of mutual obligation, tied together not by love or choice, but by oaths, taxes, and the constant fear of losing everything. This wasn't just society, it was a system. It had rules, levels, stakes, a highborn game of promises and betrayals, a real-life Game of Thrones. The king did not rule alone. He was only as powerful as the nobles who backed him or feared him. And those nobles, in turn, relied on vassals beneath them, who pledged to raise armies, collect taxes, and hold the line when rivals came knocking. But here's the twist: loyalty was never guaranteed. If a king grew weak, his lords could betray him. If a lord overreached, his vassals could revolt. And if a peasant rose up, well, he'd better have more than a pitchfork, because the whole system would crush him like a bug in a ledger. This was feudalism, not a government, not a constitution. a fragile, tangled, living organism of power born out of fear, violence, and the one thing everyone needed: land. It wasn't fair, it wasn't stable. But for almost 1,000 years, it worked. It produced knights, castles, epic wars, secret alliances, and betrayals that would make today's politics look like playground squabbles. It carved the map of Europe. It wrote blood into law, and at the heart of it all, a simple truth. In the Middle Ages, to rule was to own, and to own was to control those beneath you with sword, with signature, or with silence. This is the story of those who played that game, of those who rose, who fell, who dared to challenge the king or become one. This is the world of the feudal lords. The year is 476. The last Western Roman emperor has been overthrown. The empire that once stretched from the sands of Africa to the forests of Britain has collapsed under its own weight. What follows is not peace but vacuum. Cities crumble. Roads fall into disrepair. Long-distance trade dies. The legions are gone, and in their place warlords, raiding parties, chaos. This was not a smooth transition from empire to kingdom. It was survival, brutal, raw, desperate. In this world, no one could afford to rule from a distance anymore. There was no bureaucracy to rely on, no army waiting in the capital. If you wanted power, you needed local control. And the only way to gain that control was through land, not just land as territory, but land as leverage. A king, if he even existed, couldn't protect his entire realm. He didn't have a standing army. What he had was land to give and the ability to say, "This is yours if you defend it for me." And so he carved his realm into pieces, each piece handed out not in generosity, but in exchange. To powerful men, often former soldiers or tribal leaders, he offered titles and estates. In return, they pledged loyalty. They promised to bring men to battle, to guard the borders, to raise taxes. These men became lords. They in turn gave smaller pieces of their land to vassals, lesser lords and knights, who pledged their own oaths, raised their own small bands of warriors. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the serfs, peasants bound to the land. They didn't fight, they didn't own, they worked, they fed the entire system and received in return the most basic protection. This wasn't a system built from a master plan. It was cobbled together out of fear, out of need. A kind of chain of survival where every link was forged in oath and blood. And yet this fragile model began to stabilize a fragmented Europe. Why? Because it worked. No longer relying on distant emperors or collapsing cities, rulers built hyperlocal networks of power. Castles replaced senates. Personal loyalty replaced civic duty. Written law gave way to custom and contract, carved not on marble but into memory and military obligation. It was a return to tribal logic but dressed in the robes of kingship. It was messy. It was violent. It was full of betrayal, but it gave shape to a world that had lost its center. And by the year 1000, the feudal order was no longer a patchwork. It was the norm, a world where every lord had his land, every vassal had his oath. Every king had his rivals, and every peasant had the same patch of soil day after day until death. This is the birth of feudalism, not as an ideal, but as a response to collapse, a way to build power when the empire is gone. A way to survive when no one is coming to save you. In a modern democracy, power flows from the people upward. In the Middle Ages, it flowed downward, like rain falling from a single cloud. At the very top of the feudal system stood the king, the symbolic source of all land and authority. But the truth was more complicated. The king didn't directly rule every village, didn't collect taxes door to door, didn't fight at every border. What he truly controlled was this: the right to give land and demand loyalty. That was the king's greatest weapon. He would divide his kingdom into large territories, each gifted, or more accurately, loaned to a powerful man in return for military service and absolute allegiance. These men were his lords, also called barons, dukes, or counts, depending on the region. They were not mere tenants. They were rulers in their own right. Each lord held vast estates, some larger than small countries today. They built castles, they raised armies, they dispensed justice. They even minted local laws, and in return they had one duty. When the king called, they brought men and swords, but even the lords couldn't control everything. So they delegated downward. They divided their lands into smaller units, manors and fiefs, and entrusted them to lesser nobles. These were vassals. These were knights, military officers, loyal servants who had pledged to fight and protect in exchange for land. The vassal would receive a fief, a portion of land, along with the right to collect rent or food from those who lived there. But this was not a gift. It came with a price. Service in war and unshakable loyalty to the lord above. Failure to obey could result in exile, or worse, disinheritance. In a world where land was life, that was a death sentence without blood. At the very bottom of this towering pyramid stood the serfs. These were not quite slaves. But neither were they free. Serfs were tied to the land, born into it, bound by it, buried beneath it. They could not leave without permission. They could not own property. Their job was simple: work the fields, feed the system. They plowed. They harvested. They gave up a share of everything: crops, livestock, even their time, to their knight or lord. In return, they received protection: a castle to flee to during raids, a tiny cottage. The right to not be killed on sight by bandits. That was the trade, labor for safety. And so the chain of feudal society stretched from the dirt of the village all the way to the gilded halls of the king. To lord, to vassal, to serf. At every level, each person owed allegiance upward and demanded service downward. But here's the catch: no one was truly free. Even the king was bound to his lords, to the church, to the memory of his ancestors. Even the lords feared rebellion. Even the knights bled for land they did not fully own. And even the serfs, though crushed, could resist in small, quiet ways. Working slower, hiding grain, whispering tales of justice long gone. Feudalism was not just a system. It was a web, tight, fragile, deadly. A system built on fear, loyalty, and an unspoken understanding. If one part broke, the whole thing could fall. This wasn't just politics, it was a way of life. A living machine of land and loyalty, always shifting, always watching, always just one betrayal away from collapse. At first glance, the feudal world looked like a pyramid carved in stone. The king stood at the top, lords beneath him, vassals below them, and peasants at the bottom, holding up the entire structure. There were oaths, duties, rituals, and castles that watched over every corner of the land. It looked solid. Stable, eternal, but appearances lie. This system, for all its ceremony and structure, was never truly safe, because underneath the oaths, beneath the armor and the flags, feudalism was built on a currency more volatile than gold. Trust. And trust in the Middle Ages had a very short shelf life. Take the castles, for example. These massive stone fortresses were not built to be beautiful. They were not symbols of culture. They were machines of power, instruments of control. From the moment you saw one rising over the horizon, you understood who ruled the land. A castle meant a lord lived nearby, and that meant taxes, patrols, military levies, and watchful eyes. But it also meant danger. Because every castle was a potential rebellion waiting to happen. You see, loyalty in feudal society was not love. It was not patriotism. It was not even fear. It was a deal. And like any deal, it could be broken. If a vassal believed his lord was weak or unjust or simply not rewarding him enough, he could switch sides. He could withhold troops, refuse taxes, ally with rival lords. Sometimes he could even barricade himself inside his castle and declare war. In France, England, Germany, and beyond, entire decades were marked by these betrayals. Barons turning against kings, knights turning on their lords. Families torn apart in succession wars, land disputes, and accusations of treason. And it wasn't just the great lords who played this game. Even local tax collectors skimmed off the top. Even minor knights might shift allegiance if offered a better fief. Even priests, supposed servants of God, often acted as spies or power brokers between rival houses. Loyalty, in truth, was a matter of timing. You were loyal until it became smarter not to be, so the castles were built higher, the watchtowers doubled, messengers were sent in secret, marriages were arranged not for love but for land, for alliances, for influence. And always there was the tax. The peasant's harvest funded this game. His grain fed the soldiers. His wool clothed the lord's armies. His labor dug the moats and built the walls of castles he would never enter. And yet, despite paying the price, he had no say in any of it. He watched, season after season, as lords shifted sides, as knights changed banners, as kings sent soldiers to crush villages suspected of harboring rebels. He prayed that this year's lord would be more merciful than the last. He hoped that the soldiers would pass through quickly. He learned to bow before flags he didn't recognize. The great game of loyalty was never about him. But he was always the one caught in the middle. So while feudalism promised order, what it often delivered was tension. And underneath every oath was a question no one said aloud. How long will this peace last? Because in a world where every stone tower was both a throne and a threat, the line between service and betrayal was razor thin. And the higher the walls, the deeper the mistrust. 5 game of wills: marriage, murder, and inheritance. Estimated duration 6 to 7 minutes. If castles were the walls of power and land was its foundation, then marriage was the thread that stitched it all together. In the medieval world, love had little to do with marriage, especially among the nobility. Weddings were not celebrations, they were calculations. 2 families joined not for affection, but for land, for claims, for leverage. To marry was to move troops without ever drawing a sword. A baron with 3 daughters and no sons could control the fates of entire regions, depending on who he married them to. A clever noblewoman forced into a union she did not choose could nonetheless become the gateway to a fortune, a castle, or even a crown, and sometimes she could become a threat. Inheritance in the feudal world was a battlefield. When a powerful lord died, the question was never just who mourned him. The question was who inherited the land. Sometimes the answer was simple. The eldest son took it all, but sometimes there were no sons, only daughters, nephews, cousins. Disputed wills, forgotten promises, and in those moments of uncertainty, ambition sharpened its knives. Rival families might forge documents, clergy might be bribed, a marriage contract could appear from nowhere. A bastard child might be legitimized with a wink and a coin, and if the legal route failed, there was always the older solution. Murder, not the kind whispered about in taverns, the kind that happened quietly behind locked doors. A hunting accident, a sudden illness, a fall from the tower. Medieval Europe was full of such deaths. Suspicious, convenient, unsolved, because when power passes from hand to hand, the hand that reaches out first often wins. And if a family lost its land, it did not go quietly. Barons raised banners against the crown. Brothers fought brothers. Uncles turned on their own blood to hold on to a single castle. In England, the anarchy of the 12th century was one such example. Two claimants to the throne, Matilda and Stephen, tore the kingdom apart for nearly 2 decades, all over a contested inheritance. In France, entire provinces changed hands through the marriages of girls who were barely 12 years old. And across Europe, noble families were locked in a constant game of wills, not just the written kind, but the kind that meant strategy, patience, and if necessary, blood. The feudal system may have been built on land and loyalty. But what kept it moving was marriage, what broke it was betrayal, and what sustained it above all was this: the cold understanding that if you wanted to keep power, you had to pass it down, hold it tight, and never trust the hand that smiled while asking for it. Because in the real-life Game of Thrones, the wedding feast was often just the first act, and the next scene was written in ink, or poison, or both. 6 When lords became kings. Estimated duration 6 to 7 minutes. The feudal system was designed to maintain balance. A king at the top, lords beneath him, vassals beneath them. Each layer owed loyalty upward and commanded service downward. It was supposed to work like a chain, strong but predictable, with every link in its place. But the system had a flaw. It gave too much power to the men who stood just beneath the crown. A king could not govern every corner of his realm. He had to rely on great lords, dukes, earls, counts, to enforce his rule on the ground. He rewarded them with land, and land in the medieval world meant soldiers, taxes, and walls of stone. Over time, some of these lords became more than loyal servants. They became regional powers in their own right. They built private armies, they negotiated with foreign rulers, they held courts, levied taxes, and sometimes even defied royal orders, quietly at first, then openly. Eventually, some of them stopped behaving like vassals altogether. They started acting like kings. The most famous of them was William, Duke of Normandy. On paper, he was a vassal of the King of France, but in practice, William controlled one of the strongest duchies in Europe. When the throne of England became vacant in 1066, William didn't ask permission. He launched an invasion. He crossed the Channel, defeated the Anglo-Saxon king at Hastings, and took the crown for himself. With that victory, William changed everything. He proved that a lord, if bold enough, could rise above the king he once served. He proved that the pyramid of power was not fixed, it could be flipped. William wasn't the only one. Across Europe, ambitious lords began to test the limits of royal authority. In France, the Dukes of Aquitaine and Burgundy ruled like independent monarchs. They built alliances, married strategically, and even fought the king's armies when it suited them. In the Holy Roman Empire, powerful noble families often acted as states within a state. They passed down their titles like royal dynasties, collected their own taxes, and crowned themselves with pride. In England, the barons learned to act collectively. When King John pushed too far, they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that limited royal power for the first time. It wasn't just a legal shift, it was a statement. The king was no longer untouchable. The truth is, feudalism created its own opposition. By giving land and power to local lords, the king created rivals who could grow strong enough to challenge him. Some did it with armies. Some did it with treaties, some did it with patience. And one day, the line between lord and king began to disappear. These new kings were not born in royal palaces, they rose from castles. They didn't inherit a crown, they claimed it. Feudalism did not end when lords became kings, it evolved. The ladder that was meant to keep everyone in place became a staircase for the ambitious. From that moment on, no king could feel truly secure. because every man who knelt today might stand tomorrow.